Hi everybody. Today we're going to use Photoshop and the adjustment controls to edit an image. With every image I open up, I always want to ask myself the first question: what do I want to enhance or amend in the image? And that could be a number of different things, but I want to start with the basics today. Today we're going to talk about density and color. Density is oftentimes referred to as brightness and contrast. In this case, I want to use it in a different way, partly because I think there's much more controls to an image when you go through density. It also talks about how heavy an image is or how light an image is. But in the general sense, what I look for in an image and the density is that is it too bright or too dark, too much or too little contrast. And then the second thing I always want to consider is like what happens with the color. Are the colors shifting a little bit? Are they have a little too much saturation in the color or too little saturation, depending on the circumstances when you made the photograph. And we're going to use all of our knowledge right now to conduct what's called global adjustments. And if you remember from my digital workflow steps and procedures, we always want to change the whole image, corner to corner first, and then later we'll go in and change the sections or what we call local adjustments. So here's an image of a typical northwest day. It's a very dynamic image. It may seem, in my opinion, maybe it's just a little flat. Maybe it just needs a little bump in contrast. And maybe I might want to just back out the overcast blue sky that we have here. But kind of thing, some things you might want to consider when you look at an image is that sometimes an image may be underexposed or overexposed. So this is underexposed, means the exposure is a little bit on the heavier side, or on this one here, which is overexposed, it means that too much light was recorded on the image. And the downside with overexposure is that you start losing all this detail here within the diversity of the clouds, and you start losing some of the color renditions as well. Things get really white really quickly, and the convert or the inverse of that is that in the images that are a little underexposed, all the white parts or the light areas tend to look a little muddy and heavy. But that's one thing you might want to look at when you're looking at images. And here's another thing you might consider is that this is what we talk about contrast. Now, contrast in general terms is that it's the difference between the black areas and the white areas are greater. So that means there's it's closer to black, closer to white, as opposed to a middle gray image, which means that it's a little evenly balanced between the brights and the darks. And then we have no contrast or low contrast. And this is where like the shadow areas become very opened up in a lot more detail. You can see a lot more of the texture of the blanket or the shawl. The white areas tend to get a little bit flatter and grayer in some ways. You get a little bit more detail in the clouds here, which is really great, which it may not be suitable for all situations. And then on the bottom half of the two images here on the left and right, it talks about color. Saturation looks very similar to contrast, except that you have all the information here, so there's not much contrast here between like the blacks and the whites and the dark areas, but you have the color is a little bit more vibrant and a little punchier. And then with low saturation, it starts taking out all the color. It looks a little bit like an antique image, or may look closer to black and white. By the way, I don't recommend using desaturating an image to get your black and white. There's actually more effective ways to do that. But in this case, we want to see if images are getting a little too flat or too low contrast. I want to switch over to Photoshop, and we're going to look at that image and how to do all the controls. So the first thing I would do for you folks is to find out where the various control panels that we need to do all this work. All your control panels live up here in the Windows section If it has a check mark, that means it's somewhere on the desktop and ready to use. I'm going to pull them out here. We're going to need the properties. We're going to need the layers. We're going to need the adjustments. And we're going to need the info panels. Using the combination of all four of these panels will give us all the controls necessary to work on what we're looking for. And let me go back here real quick. Let's see here. Now, in this particular class, we're only going to use these four panels: the info, adjustments, properties, and layers. And for the adjustments, we're only going to use these three particular control panels: the curves, color balance, hue, and saturation. These three controls can manage everything from density to color in multitudes of ways. Okay, then we'll go back to Photoshop. So here we are. We have our adjustments, info panel, layers, and properties. Now, generally, I want to leave these in the middle of the screen so you kind of see what's going to happen here. I have some other panels here that open up to the side here. We're not going to really touch those, but I'll give you kind of a tour of what they do in just a moment. So right up here, I want to zoom in. Here's the adjustments that we're going to be using. There are 16 adjustments, and they're categorized in order of preference. The top row all deal with the density of an image, the brightest, darkness, if you want to say it that way. And there's about 5 different ways to do the same exact thing. And curves is the preferred way because this actually has more of a comprehensive 360 degree kind of a control, whereas the others are very linear, like the brightness and contrast and levels, which we're kind of familiar with our TVs. But curves is much more dynamic and actually has a lot more ability than the other controls on this row. Next row, which is the second level. So again, we start off with the density, changing that first. Then we come down and we work on the color. Color, we're going to use the hue and saturation, and we're going to use the color balance, the one right next to it. And then the last layer is something that we won't get into in this class, and these are the ones that are a little bit more advanced, color or Photoshop retoucher kind of controls. It's generally, not useful in this class, but for the most part, we can get by with the first two levels. Now, I want to scoot this a little bit to the side a little bit here. So I want you to watch what happens. These three panels, the adjustment, layers, and the property panels, are all going to change once I push a control. So if I push the curves, what's going to happen? Wait for the spinning rainbow. There we go. So let me back up one. All right. So when I push the curves, it adds on here a layer, and then the control panel for that layer is right here in the properties menu. I'll put this to the side for a moment. Now, nothing's changed on the image yet because you always start off with the bases. And I want to zoom in so we can just get a little tighter control here. This is your image right here. This is what's called the histogram of the image. This is the black areas. This is the white areas on the horizontal scale. On the vertical scale, it goes from dark at the bottom and light to the top. This is your neutral line, which is what you start off with your image with no controls or adjustments. And simply, you can grab this line with the left click and hold, and you can just pull it up And you'll see the image get brighter if I go this direction, and you'll see the image gets darker if I go in this direction. Now, in this case, a couple of things about Photoshop as far as like, um, what we're looking for when we Photoshop. One thing is that, Photoshop, there's ways that you can tell if Photoshop has been performed on an image, or but the ultimate goal is to make it look like nothing's ever changed with the image. But even though it has, but you want to make sure it's kind of seamless. And a couple of things I'm always interested in is the highlights and the dark values. And if you were to examine this image a little closer, you can see the dark texture and the variations between that pattern inside this dark swatch. So that's something I don't want to lose. Actually, the idea is to actually have as much detail as you can. It's real easy to make something dark or light, but it's harder to find that fine control somewhere in between. So in this case, I think her hair could use a little bit of lightening. I might just kind of put that there. I want to make the dark areas, this is the dark area right here, a little darker. And then I'm just going to grab this over here with a second point by left click and hold, and I'm just going to bring up the contrast just a little bit, just for her hair. Maybe, you know what, I'm starting to lose this area right down in here. You can see there. And I also turned on my keyboard commands. So if you want to learn how to use your left hand to do some work while your right hand is doing all the mousing, you can hold down this one here. I can hold down the space bar and I can grab the part of the image and move it around where I need to. So in this case, I'm losing this, so I might want to just bring this back up to a more neutral position. And this is the difference between using your brightness and contrast and using curves. With brightness and contrast, it does the rate of darkness and lightness adjustments are the same. They're equal to each other. So it would do this, okay? And then you can see that you get contrast. With curves, I can actually tell it to leave the dark values where they're at and just change the light values, because I like the dark values here because it kind of gives me that detail in the shawl, but I just want to bump it just a little bit like that, and that way I get some contrast. Now, if you come over to the layers panel, so that what this is, it's a way of editing the image without what's called a destructive process. Old days, we used to be able to do all these same things and we just do it on one layer. But if you did all that information change on one layer and save it, there's no way of undoing it later. Hence why Photoshop developed the layers process. And we put the layers in here. We can actually change this later down the line if we say, oh, we need a little bit more contrast or we need to reduce it. You can always come back and forth and edit it. And the handy thing about this is that you can always see the before and after by clicking the eyeball. So here's the after, here's the before, after, before. And this is a way that you can get a comparative look of like what changes took place. You can see that all the bright areas got a little bit brighter. The dark areas kind of stay the same a little bit, but they stay the same. And this area right in here, so you have your shadows and your highlights, and this is what's called your midtones right here. So you can see like the midtones and the highlights all got a little bumped up a little bit. Now, that's one layer. Let's say I like this for right now, and I'm going to go down to the next level. I want to start changing some colors. So first off, I want to work with the color balance. And again, if you click the color balance on the adjustment panel, another layer pops up corresponding with the symbols, and it says color balance. And then your properties panel comes over here with some options. So the first thing I'll look at is that there's what's called the tone of the image. And this is where we talk about the shadows, highlights, and midtones of an image. The best way to kind of think about this is highlights is all the white ends, everything on the white side. Shadows is everything on the dark side, dark blues, navies, blacks, and so on. And then the midtones is kind of like the between space between highlights and shadows, which is this image has a lot more midtones and highlights than it does shadows. So for this instance, I'm going to actually control just well, I'll control the midtones first, and then we can get an idea. So I think it's got a little bit too much blue in here. And that's kind of typical on a day, any Pacific Northwest day. So I can actually come in here and say, I want to just warm up the blues a little bit by adding a little bit of yellow. And you can see that the whole image is starting to change and shift towards the yellow side. All right. If I were to go the opposite direction, I get more of the blue side. I might actually think about this as a little bit of cyan and a little bit of yellow. So I might just kind of push it over here a little bit. And you can see it just kind of cleans it up a little bit. Maybe I'll just go a little bit this way. Maybe I add a little bit of cool colors. So again, I can go to the eyeball, and you can see that there's a subtle bit of change in there. Now, I did it with the midtones. I want to zero this out. If you want to zero anything, all the adjustment panels or the properties have what's called the undo, click undo button, that you can zero everything out. This time, I'm just going to go to the highlights because a lot of this image is mostly highlights and midtones. But I want to push the highlights because, again, anything you push with the highlights, it does impact the midtones and less on the shadows. So I want to do the same thing. Let's add a little bit more yellow here. Whoops, I forgot to turn it on. Always remember to have your layer turned on. If you want, whoops, that's definitely yellow. And then if you want to switch between layers, you just got to make sure the layer is highlighted like this one here. The control panel and the properties change accordingly. But I want to make sure I have the color balance on and the eyeball turned on. I'll go up here to highlights. And you can see I push it to drastic yellow. It puts a lot more yellow in there, especially in the highlights. But maybe I just need to just warm it up just a little bit, not too drastically. There. Try that. And it just kind of cleans it up just a little bit. It's just a tiny little change there. Now, the third control I want to talk about is the hue and saturation. And this is where we talk about the intensity of a color, the brightness of color. And this is the saturation part. I generally recommend leave your lightness at 0 because once you change your lightness, it ultimately kind of messes up with your curves. So I kind of just leave that at 0. There's not a point where you want to change that. And I think there's a more effective control if you use your curves to kind of make that adjustment. So I come in here, it's like, maybe let's just kind of play with it a little bit. This is the saturation here. The further you push it up in the positive, you see that the color intensity increases. Now, another thing about Photoshop is that, again, we try to make these adjustments to where it looks like there's nothing that's ever been changed or performed on it. As you can see here, it's kind of obvious that this has been, manipulated or, changed in a way that's so drastic. But the key is, kind of in, just adding little highlights or little elements of adjustments. There's that one. And you can see it just got a little bit of a pop of the color. It kind of helps to stand out a little bit. Now, a couple of things just about house cleaning business here. You can turn off all these controls here, and you can see what the beginning image looks like. And you can turn them back on with the eyeball to see what they look like with the adjustments. For house cleaning, I would suggest selecting all of these controls. And again, you can hold the Shift key down and click each one of these and put them into a folder. There's a little folder tab right here. You can either do this one of two ways. I'm just going to create the folder. Whoops. And then I'm just going to place them inside the folder. And if you watch the highlight, you'll see that there's a little blue line there. Once it highlights the box or the encircling box of the folder, it will go inside of it. Otherwise, it just goes in between other layers. Now, this is the indentation of a folder or hierarchy. Here's a folder, and then there's the indentation of the contents in the folder. If it's not in the folder, it's going to be outside and push towards the left. Now, the nice thing about a folder is that I can actually just turn off one button to control everything inside that folder and turn it all off, or I can go inside there and control just each one independently. So here you have the original image, and here you have the adjustment controls. It just kind of gave it a little bit of a pop. I think it might be a little too contrasty now, so I might come back over here and kind of just tone that down a little bit. Now, earlier I mentioned two parts of the image that we always want to control as photographers. We want to control our shadows and our highlights. And that's part of that is that there's a range. And if you get to this where it's very black and very white, it's another way of telling or indicating to folks that it's been heavily photoshopped. Photographers, particularly fine art photographers or art photographers or even advertising photographers, want to make sure that there is actually a tonal range between the black and the whites, and that the whites aren't too bright and the white and the blacks are not too dark. So I want to take this control here and I want to drastically kind of push it a little bit to get that brightness and darkness in that thing. Now, this is very easy to do. And again, we can tell that it's been heavily photoshopped at this point. The whites are white, the darks are darks, and this is where the control panel or the info panel comes in handy. So in photography, we have a range of 0 to 255 for all three colors, R, G, and B, red, green, and blue. And that kind of controls all of our, all of our aspects of how we see the light. So what happens is that if we get to 255 across the board, you will see that it's pretty much white. Or if you get no color, which is all going to be black. So I'll just turn this back on. You can see that's black, but by numbers, it's best to kind of go by the numbers to see where you're at, because don't you let your eyes fool you. So here's the white. The numbers here. So there's the RGB numbers. There's a set of numbers before the parentheses and a set of numbers, set of numbers before the slash mark and a set of numbers after the slash mark. The numbers before the slash mark are the numbers that you started with without any Photoshop changes. So if I were to turn that off, that's about the 232, 233, 235. That's gray across the board. It's a little bit more blue than it is red, which is very true. And then I come over here. I can't find that one particular spot, but you can see that the numbers, before numbers of 235, 236, 238, in that range that we saw earlier. But the numbers on the other side of the slash mark is 255. That is pure white. And when it goes to print, it's just going to, there's not any ink going to go onto the paper. It's just going to be the white of the paper. And for photographers, we want to kind of keep that the distinction in there. And if I go down to the black areas of this blue area here, this is a navy blue shawl, so it has a little bit more blue into it. But you can see that the before numbers range around the 13, 16, 21, and then the after numbers is 1, 2, and 3, so it's very dark. Pretty much going to be black on the page. Again, we want to control that and not be that extreme, because there's a beauty in seeing that diversity of the clouds and the diversity within the color range that you have here. So here, again, this is back to more normal. You can see that the dark area, especially on the line, is back at the baseline. And then you can see that, this got pushed up a little bit up here. A couple ways to control that is that with the control panel, I want to zoom in here. This one here at the top of the white end, you can actually bring it down, down the line to kind of help the gray get so white. It's not advised to bring it out into the middle, because what happens is you shorten your total range for the entire image. You want to keep it on the extreme, so that way you know where the outer borders are for the image. And I want to put that back. So you can see here that I can pop that, and it's got a little tinge of gray there, still a little flat, still not my liking, but nonetheless you can control the highlights by just giving it a little bit of grayness especially when it prints on paper. If you have any questions, let me know. Later on, we're going to use the same controls, and then we're going to control parts of the image. We're going to control, like a very particular section of an image. But ideally, we can do everything that we need to do with color and density with curves, color balance, hue, and saturation. Thanks. Enjoy the day.